Okay, this is the second part. Last time what we did was just generate a user interface with adding just one widget on the sidebar menu. In this case, to upload a CSV. If you run the application, what we have is an application that looks like this, and we can open this on browser like so, and then we have the ability to upload a CSV like that, and we generated that CSV as well. So let's go ahead now and add a few things to this application. So the first thing we're going to add on this series is maybe start to work with the server function to identify when this file has been loaded and maybe pop up a message to the user that the file has been loaded, and then maybe make a few changes to the main body when that has been loaded. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we're going to do though, as we think about this, is we make sure that we set the file size. So the idea is to increase or set the maximum file size we're willing to have this application hold. And we do that by calling the options function, and within that we're going to say shiny dot max request size in one folder. And for now we're just going to start this as 30 multiplied by 20 by 1024. That is going to be raised to the power of 4. That's going to be enough. But if you're working with much larger file sizes, this is going to be large enough, but if you're working with much larger file sizes, then you might need to tweak that number, or if you wanted a smaller provision as well. Alright, so once we have that, the first thing we need to make sure that we're checking is whether the file has been loaded. Right, this UI right here only loads a file but doesn't evaluate whether a file has been loaded. And because we've provided specific information about a CSV, we're going to assume that a CSV is going to be loaded. So we're not going to worry about making conditions to make sure that it's a CSV file. We're just going to check to see if the file has been loaded. And the way we do that is we create a reactive data object. And so let's see how we actually do that. So we're going to call just create a variable called data, and it's going to use the reactive function from Shiny, like so. And for most of the functions that we're going to be using, once you call the Shiny functions like reactive, and in some cases you will see render functions, for example, we are going to write most of our code within the curly brackets after the parentheses. Okay, so we're always going to set that, and we can close this up, maybe clean it up a little bit. So what's the first thing we're going to do? We're going to say that the file that we need to check is equal to input $. Now let's talk about the significance of this. We know that our function takes in an input, and this is where we're using it. And we're going to specify what kind of input by passing in the ID of the input. So in this case, on the sidebar, we created a file input with the ID CSV file, which means if we wanted a different file input, we could provide a different ID. So we're going to copy this ID here and then paste it here. And that way, this variable is going to refer to this object, to this file input object up there. All right, what do we want to check? We want to check if this file has anything, right? We want to make sure that we're checking if it has anything. If it doesn't have anything, we know that there is no upload there. If it has something, we know that there's a file contained. So in this case, we're going to use is null. Right? Is null checks whether the file has nothing. So right, I'm going to check the file there, and if this is true, I mean all we need here is to return nothing. Right? We don't need to return anything. But if this is not true, right, if there is in fact something in this file name, what we would like to return is a read.csv. So we're going to read that as a file, and the file name will now be part of the file $data path. So this file that we have read here, if there is a file, in fact, if there's a file that has been loaded from the input widget, the path of the file name will be provided within this, within this specification of the actual file. So we're going to read that file as a CSV. Okay, so that's all this code is doing, and this file will be stored as a reactive object in this data variable. Okay. Now that still doesn't change anything. What we maybe want to do to get a sense of what is going on in the background here is to create um, like a message to the user that, well, if the file is not loaded, I want the message to be, hey, welcome to this data application. Please begin loading a CSV. But if it's loaded, then we want to make sure that we say, hey, maybe your file has been loaded, or we can start, looking at some of the contents of that file, and then that way we know that our application is loading and that our functions are working well. So let's create a render main. I'm going to call it main grid in this case. And the way we do this is we start with an output. We define an output ID, right? And this output ID will be called the main grid. And this is going to have a render UI. It's going to use the render UI function from Shiny. And so what this render UI, basically, what it's going to do is, what I envision it doing is looking at whether this data object has a CSV. And if it has a CSV, then we can just give a message like your data has been loaded properly. But if for example, it doesn't have a CSV, then we want to display the message that, hey, welcome to this application. We notice that you haven't loaded anything in here, so maybe load it to begin using the application. And we pretty much do the same thing we've done up here, right? We're going to say if is.null. So we're checking if it's null. And now we're no longer checking the file, right? Because the reactive function here is going to constantly check whether this ID has something and return a CSV. So now we're checking this variable here. Okay, and the way we do that is we call data, and then we use parentheses because it's a little bit of a complex data object because it's a reactive data object. Okay, and we're going to check if that is null. Then what do I want to do? I want to give a message out, and the way I do that is I use the paragraph tag. So this is a little bit of the HTML that we would need, but don't worry, it's just the P. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to say something like, welcome to the data visualization application, comma. I'm going to use the break tag as well, which is just going to separate these into the second string into a different line. And I could say something like, to begin, please upload a CSV. Okay, like so. Right. So again, the logic that is going on behind here is we have a reactive object that is going to constantly check if this is null or not. If it's not null, then it's going to read the CSV and pass it to this data, to this variable here we created. On the output grid, we're going to check that data, and if it's null, then we know that there is no file that has been loaded. But if it's not, so if there is something on there, we could use the else statement here and say something like, use another paragraph tag and say, the data has been loaded. Okay. All right. Now what we have done here is we have created an output ID that has a rendering function, but we have to pass this output ID somewhere. And the way we do that is we would, remember, this is going to the body now. Conceptually thinking about it, this has to go to the body. So if we come to the dashboard body here, what we need to say then is we want the UI output function. This UI output function will just take the ID that we generated. So in this case, the ID we generated was this main grid. Copy that, paste it here, save this. Now we should all the changes that we have done should work out just fine. So let's go ahead and reload this application. Right? All right, so we have, okay, it has worked, but not in the way that we want it to, because we want to make sure that this is more centered, and that's some CSS stuff. We can really change that quickly. But the idea now is that we have in fact checked whether the file has been loaded, and because it's not loaded, it's going to say welcome to the data visualization application to begin upload a CSV. If we upload the CSV, it's telling us that the data has been loaded. So we know that we have a way to check for this. So maybe, yeah, we can change a few things here. We could say something like add align equals to center. And what this does is just a CSV to align all of this information here into the center, and we can do the same thing here by just copy pasting. We're going to change this else in a bit, but I want to make sure that you, in case you wanted to do something like this, you could quickly do it. So now, okay, so now we have this aligned at the center on the body, right? And if we upload a CSV, it should work the same, right? The data has been loaded, everything is central. So now we need to make a few changes in the body, maybe add a few pages here, and what we call them in Shiny is we call them tabs. Okay, so we're going to add a few tabs here, a couple for visualization, a couple to see what the actual raw data looks like. Okay, so let's do that, and I think that would be the last thing before we ran out of time here. I don't want to make these videos way too long. Okay, so let's see, how are we going to deal with that? Okay, so we want to add, right? We want to add different tabs in this case, and that is in fact not very difficult to do, because remember we already have the else statement here, so we can pretty much just modify this section here, right? We can take this away and modify it, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to add something we call tab set panel. And tab set panel, just like what we did with the sidebar menu, which basically is a container for as many menu items that you need, tab set panel is very much similar in the context, in that we can add as many tabs as we need. So in this case, let's add 3 tabs. Okay, the first, and the way we add a tab is we call it tab panel, the Shiny function. This is going to add the tab on there, and let me just copy this and paste it 3 times. Well, in fact, let's just add the arguments first, and then we'll paste the result of that 3 times. So the first panel tab I want to add is going to have the correlation plot. Okay, and because we're not pasting anything in that tab for right now, let's just leave it at that. So I can copy this, and then I can paste it down there, and then also paste this here. Separate these by a comma, otherwise you're going to run into an error. So let's clean this up a little bit. All right, so this is going to close the else statement. This is a tab set panel, and what we have here is correlation plot. Let's maybe change this to distribution plot, and let's maybe change this to raw data. And the idea here is very simple, and then in correlation plot we're going to have some correlation. I think we're going to do a correlation heat map together with a scatter plot. A distribution plot, we're going to do some box plots here, and the raw data is just going to render what the CSV contains. And I think that's probably the best place to start. That once we upload a CSV, let's look at what the data in the CSV looks like. So let's save this, and I'm just going to clean a few things up a little bit here by separating some of these arguments, some of these strings in the paragraph tag. I think that's good enough for me. So save this, run this application, and everything is still centered. Right? We're going there, we're going to upload our CSV like so. And now we've created 3 tabs. There's nothing in the tabs yet, but we have 3 areas where we can display different kind of information as we see fit. Okay, All right, so we're going to do one more thing. I don't know how many minutes we are by now. We're going to do one more thing here, and that's just to render the raw data here, and then we'll call it, and in the next section we'll add a few more things. So to do that, I usually prefer to have my render main grid as the last thing, so I'm just going to go above it, and I'm going to say here we're going to render raw data, like so. And again, this is going to be an output because it's something we're rendering. It's an output ID. And in this case, let's just call it raw data. That's the ID. And this is going to be a render data table. As you see, the very first option I get. And in here, this is probably going to be the easiest line of code you're going to do. All you need to do is to call the data object, right? And the reason being, right, this data variable that we created here is always going to check whether there is an input file. If there is, it's going to read that CSV, and all we need to do is to pass a CSV here. So if there isn't anything, it's not going to be rendered, and in fact it won't be, because if there is nothing, you'll only see this welcome message, but if there is, it's going to render this. Now, just like how we did with the output here with main grid, we had to use the UI output function to render this rendering, right? This render UI. We also have to do the same thing here. We have to provide a data table output ID that renders this ID, which obviously renders this this data frame here. So because we are looking at the last tab panel, right? Remember, the first argument was the raw data, which is the title of the panel. The second now would be that data table output, like so, right? And this is going to take the ID we just created. In this case, the ID was raw data, like so. All right. So with that being said, let's just run the application, see if we have made any mistakes. Run the application. Everything seems to be running just fine. I'm going to widen that up. At some point, I should just open this on browser. So yeah, let's just open it on browser like that, and then go look for the file. The file is there. Okay, it's uploaded. And now we see what the data looks like on our third tab, which is the raw data tab. There's nothing still here because we haven't added the code to do that. And we see that we can do a little bit of filtering. So if we had Setosa only, right, it's going to give me only Setosa there. If you heard, I think Virginica is the other option. You could filter it by that way, and you can do something like, I think, if you only look for 2.3, might only give you what is available in 2.3. You can do only the maximum number here, and that's a very neat feature because this is on the get-go you get these kinds of filters. Okay, and there are other ways to do these kinds of rendering too, particularly for CSVs. All right, something like a R Hansen table is a good alternative. So I think we should call it for now. Yeah, we should call it here, and in the next section what we're going to do is we're going to work on updating maybe the correlation plot and the distribution plot, and while we work on updating this, we in fact are going to create a few more sidebar menu items that will give us the filters to select what we want to see in the correlation plot and things like that. So until the next session, this is what we have so far.